Good morning, everyone. Please take a seat. Day 2. You can take a seat anywhere, no special seats this morning. And you've been allocated, you're wonderful there, Paul. You've been allocated another group today for later. I'll talk about that later. So let's get everyone sitting down wherever they feel comfortable. And Ines, Luciana, come and join me briefly, please. Co-leads.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Hello, good morning. If we can have everybody's attention now, we should start this day's activities. So it is our second day here at the workshop. We are very happy that you are very energetic people starting a second day of this very challenging theme. And so Ines, my colleague here, will present the ideas that we have prepared for today. The general concept of the day is how can we go forward in this discussion. Yesterday we spoke about issues that have been done in the past. So today the idea is how we can go on. And we have to think that we are now in 2020. We have started this new decade. And we are proposing things until 2050. So it's really looking forward, looking to the future, thinking about new technologies, new ways that we can approach issues, thinking about new generations that are going to come, how problems related or challenges related to biodiversity, nature, people, economy, growth, not growth, when anything, how the world is going to be in 2050 will very much depend on how resources will be mobilized for biodiversity and environment in general, starting from now. So my colleague Ines will give some guidelines on how we prepared the activities for the day, and we very much look forward to the results of this day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and also good morning on my behalf. And I think Luciana is expecting a little bit too much from me because I think Natasha jumping up and down to do the logistics and to explain to you, no worries, to explain what's going to happen today. I also just wanted to welcome you. Very happy to see you all here, and that thank you very much for the active engagement yesterday. As Luciana said, today is forward-looking, and I'm glad she already talked about looking beyond what we know now. This is really about 2030, where do we want to be, and what are the options, solutions for resource mobilization that we would have to have by then, and how can we build them up? So the discussions today will really be about that, like, let's be creative, think out of the box. And we know there's a lot of obstacles, and we know we heard from the experiences yesterday that some things work, a lot of things don't, and we also need to identify why and how to solve those. But today is really about, we need to solve this, we can solve this. We've got a lot of seeds, a lot of examples, a lot of already very good things going on. How can we upscale them? How can we actually bring them out and make them stronger? So the questions you'll have today before you on different topics is about what would be the possible solutions, what are the key options that could bring us to where we need to be in 2030, and also look at what do we need to make that work. So very much counting on all of you and encouraging you to be as forward-looking and as open-minded as possible. Try to find ways of moving us beyond what we have now into a much better world in 2030. Okay. So with that, I'll leave it to Natasha to run you through the logistics of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, co-leads. Very happy to. So we have a really full day today. We'll be starting off by trying to open our minds a little bit more as to what we could be thinking of when it comes to resource mobilization in the future. And then passing over to you in a whole series of workshops, 5 hours of discussing these out-of-the-box potential solutions, options, and also what we need to overcome in order to get there. And it's a really exciting day and an invitation to you to actually get out of comfort zones, I suppose, because we will be in very mixed groups, so you can confront yourselves with what other people perhaps think is possible, and ask yourself, okay, if that were to be possible in my context, what would need to change, rather than coming from your context and saying, won't work here. Right? So let's try and think ahead and then say, okay, that would mean we would have to change the following. Right? So we're going to we don't need to negotiate, and that's the real joy about being here. Please, don't get into wordsmithing, don't get into the negotiation style. This is not about numbers, this is not about targets, this is about options and trying to make visions more tangible. Right? So I'm looking forward to that very, very much indeed. I just want to remind you of what the co-leads said yesterday, because I think there was a little bit of a aha and sort of mindset change yesterday when we were talking about the role of mainstreaming, the role of capacity building with resource mobilization. And I remember you were saying the blank look on some of our faces when we were thinking mainstreaming or ABS, what's that got to do with resource mobilization? And coming to this understanding that resource mobilization is not just the generation of new funds, it is that as well, but it's also reducing the need for resources, i.e. mainstreaming and avoiding the sort of degradation, and also enhancing the use of the resources that we have through capacity building, for example, and increased efficiency. And I would actually like to just test the water and see whether this understanding that that's what we're talking about, whether that resonates with you or not. So perhaps, Caroline, could we have the first Wisembly vote? Could I ask you to get your smartphones out or use your computer or whatever, go on app.wisembly.com. As many of you as possible, please, then we get more of an understanding as to how this group is ticking. And the question is, which of the following can help change the narrative behind resource mobilization? Have we got it, Caroline? Yeah. So you should be receiving that vote and be able to vote on it. Is it there yet? Yep, thank you. Can we see it up here on the screen? So you should be able to vote. And you can vote many times. So you can vote for all of the answers, avoid the need, enhance the efficiency, generate new resources, and none of the above. Or you can vote on individual ones. So if you think that we can change the narrative behind resource mobilization by all of the top 3, then press all of the top 3, right? Or if you think it's only one of them, then just press that one, or if you think it's only 2, press those 2. Can we see the results as they come in, or do we have to wait until the end? We have to wait. Okay. How many are coming in? So you can press as many times as you want. 17, that's not enough. Do you have to press save or send or anything at the end? Yes. So don't forget to save it once you've voted. 90. Okay, let's have a couple more. Looking good though. What do you think? Let's go for 100. We've got a ton. Okay, what do you think? All right. So 1% says none of the above. Avoiding the need is actually at the top of the list. That's really interesting. So generating new. So it looks like you're saying generating new resources and avoiding the need. That's where we see most opportunities to change the narrative, but also enhancing the efficiency of existing resources is up there. So it does seem to be that you're endorsing this balance of the 3 aspects of resource mobilization: avoiding, enhancing, and generating. Great, thank you. I'd like to encourage you with perhaps another question to start thinking outside of the box a little bit. Can we have the next question up, which is, which image, I'm going to give you a series of 8 images, which image best symbolizes what you think we need to do to ensure successful resource mobilization in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework? Just choose one of those images. Which of those images best symbolizes what you need, what you think we need to do? Just press one of them. There's no right or wrong here. I might ask one or two of you why you've chosen the image you've chosen. How many have we got? Oh, come on. Gut feeling. Don't forget to press save or send. Let's have a couple more. Okay. Let's have a look at the result. That's the top? Okay, what does that mean? Is that the top now? Which one is the top? Can we stop them from moving? So we had the hands at the top. The first one was lots of hands together. What is that? What's that representing? Just call it out. Co-creation. Everyone's fingerprints. You're all fault. All of your fault. Okay. Did I hear youth somewhere? Yeah, youth. All right. Then we've got the ant rolling something up the hill. That was also a popular one. What's that standing for? Almost there. Okay. Oh, lots of optimism. What else? Hard work. You're the end. There it is, that ant. What about the market? What's that representing? Diversity? Sharing? What about that? Quite a few of you chose the fish, one of the fish going in different direction. Changing direction? Innovation? Okay, thank you. So do feel free to think out of the box, think picture, right? Where is it we want to be, and what sort of things are we going to have to be doing differently? There's no right or wrong here. It's about creating perhaps very innovative, new, out-of-the-box solutions. Okay, let's go back to the presentation, please. And we can go straight into item 5 of the agenda. So I'm going to click I can't click anymore. Can you click on, please, for me? Thank you. Changing the narrative. So we're right there, changing the narrative for biodiversity finance, and we're looking at recent work on costs and benefits arising from the implementation of the Post-2020 framework. So we're going to start with Diane Mortimer from the UK on the Dasgupta review. Diane, where? There she, Diana. Diana. Sorry, Diana. Well, we can get rid of the typo. A round of applause for Diana, please. Are you comfortable? You can go down.
Can I have the clicker? Can I have the clicker?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry.
My telepathy is not that good at this time in the morning. Good morning, everybody, and good to see everybody's up and early this morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. And I hope today I'll give you a flavour of what we're doing. It's going to be rather broad brush. Sorry, I stand back and gesticulate and walk around, and that's not very helpful. And I also really appreciate being invited to this workshop, as we're very much in a listening mode as well. So we want to know what, from our review, would resonate with the rest of the world so that we can produce something that actually will help people make a difference. So just to give you a bit of background to the review, it was commissioned in March last year by our Chancellor. He's the top minister in the UK Department of Finance. And the idea is to provide an independent assessment of the value of biodiversity. So this report is not a UK government view, but it's something that the UK government wanted to commission to get some more ideas about. The review is being led by Professor Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge University and supported by people from UK Departments of Finance, Environment and Science, with both economic and environmental experts involved. And we hope that because this review is coming out of a finance ministry and involves experts from that ministry, that we will be able to produce something that resonates with the people that hold the money bags. So that the idea is that it's something that hasn't been done before. Although if you know of anybody that has done something from a finance ministry before, we'd really like to know about it, because it's always good to learn from what others have done. So, hold on, get this working, and that working, and that working. Right. So Professor Dasgupta was asked to consider a broad range of topics under the review. For example, what economic benefits come from biodiversity? What are the links between environmental resources and our ability to achieve economic growth? What can organisations, both public and private, do to encourage more sustainable use of natural resources? And how does biodiversity loss affect people, for example, through their health and well-being? The review is definitely not about putting a monetary value on biodiversity. We will not be saying that biodiversity is worth X million dollars. That is not what we're here to do. And I know that everybody in this room is aware that biodiversity loss stems from a systemic failure by governments, business, communities and individuals to adequately account for nature and the services it provides in their decisions. And this represents a significant global economic blind spot. The scientific consensus is that we need to correct it urgently. So this review is about how people engage with nature. That's to say, what people take from nature, how we transform it, and what we return to the planet in terms of waste and pollution. And what can we now do to address the problems we've caused? So the first big issue the review tackles is to consider biodiversity in terms of a business. That's to say, we're considering nature as an asset, just like any business considers its factories, land, and workforce as assets in terms of produced and human capital. The review will argue that economics of biodiversity requires us to manage our assets more sustainably and efficiently to improve our wealth and well-being. And achieving sustainable economic prosperity by which we mean increased wealth and well-being, and that whole concept of wealth and well-being is something else that will get heavily unpacked in the review, requires us optimising our total portfolio of assets, whether that's natural, human, or produced capital, and not considering all three is a major misstep. But it's also important to recognise that nature itself has a portfolio of natural assets. One size does not fit all when it comes to the management of the environment. Environmental assets also need to be managed sustainably if nature is to continue to provide us with the services on which our economies and well-being rely. We know and understand that just as diversity within a portfolio of financial assets reduces risks and uncertainty, so does diversity within a portfolio of natural assets. That is to say, biodiversity increases nature's resilience to shocks, reducing the risk to services on which we rely. The review will therefore seek to understand and address biodiversity loss by viewing it as a portfolio asset management problem. The review will focus on ways in which we are mismanaging our assets and provide recommendations on how we can address this poor management. So, why are we failing to manage our natural assets sustainably? We're all aware of the imbalance between humanity's demand on nature and the resources that are being used to meet these demands, and the supply of resources on which we rely. And we understand that these demands are due to various reasons, such as population growth, increased and unsustainable consumption, and additionally the waste and pollution created by human activities, which place further demands on the planet. And we also know that the supply of resources and the planet's ability to deal with waste is also limited. The science tells us that extracting from and putting waste into our planet compromises the ability of nature to provide services. But importantly, this feedback loop has not been recognised in most mainstream models of economic growth and development, or assumptions about expected perpetual increases in future consumption, on which many global and national economic models rely. In the review, we call this the impact equation. And the impact equation shows us that if we put more demands on the planet, it's true, if we put more demands on the planet than it can supply, then the biosphere depreciates or completely turns off in that case. So that is one of the most fundamental aspects of the review is this impact equation. So the second sort of key theme that's running through the review is on inclusive wealth. So the review will explore whether the total portfolio of capital assets, natural, human and produced, are being used efficiently. And managing our portfolio of assets effectively requires estimating changes in the value of the stocks of the assets in the portfolios, including natural capital. And this is an important point because most studies before have considered the flows and not the stocks of the capital. So we're trying to address how can we look after the stock better, which in simple terms is biodiversity and nature. So the value of our total stock of assets is our inclusive wealth. And this includes all forms of assets, not just those traditionally used to define how well a country is performing. So inclusive wealth is a measure of prosperity which, unlike mainstream economic growth measures such as GDP, accounts for all types of assets, natural, produced, and human. And by inclusive wealth, we mean the social value of the economy's total stock of capital goods. So that includes ecosystems, soil, air, and water. It includes the roads, buildings, and ports that we've created. And it also includes the education, health, and personal knowledge of the people on the planet. Inclusive wealth also allows decision makers to maximize society's well-being. It's suggested that increasing our inclusive wealth over time leads to corresponding increases in social well-being. In other words, inclusive wealth and social well-being are two sides of the same coin. This might mean, for example, we should move away from national income accounts to national balance sheets, which cover the total stocks of assets and give us a better indication of how our wealth is progressing. So just to conclude, addressing severe biodiversity loss and supporting economic prosperity requires transformative change, as was recognised through IPBES global assessment last year. The review will offer a conceptual framework for doing so. It will also provide guidance for economic and finance decision makers on how to apply that framework in practice to different sectors. The review will also outline policy options for transformative change. And by this we mean that we need to rethink our measures of economic success. Sustainable economic prosperity and development should be measured by inclusive wealth, not GDP. Doing so will allow us to account for nature and properly appreciate the trade-offs and feedback loops between investments in different types of capital assets, whether they are human, natural, or produced. Economic and financial decisions should be viewed through the lens of the impact equation and consider levers to change both our demand on nature, for example, consumption, population, and the efficiency with which we extract from and pollute nature, and nature's supply of goods and services, the actual stock of natural capital, and the rate at which it can renew itself. The review will suggest options for transformative change that address the core components of the impact equation. We will consider levers including institutions, policy, economic evaluation, finance and technology. So, a small mountain to climb, as we wish to transform the whole way that the world looks at its economy, but it's a step, we hope, in the right direction. We have until September this year to produce the report, so we're at a very fast stage in trying to get something written that we can then get out for some peer review. One of the things that we're also very interested in is if people have case studies that can be used to represent where there have been good examples of changes where we're actually considering our stocks in a positive way, or where there have been collapses of stocks. So, you know, the fishing is a classic example, or where you can show that when you manage assets better, for example, Catskill Mountains, most famous one, of water treatment, those kind of things. We'd love to hear some new ones, exciting ones that are coming out. So if anybody knows of anything, please let me know, and please get in contact with me or through our team email at the bottom there. Thank you very much.
Just take a seat here, Diana. Thank you very much. We're filling up our panel, and we should have a little bit of time at the end of the morning to also invite you to get into a short discussion with our panelists. So thanks, Diana. I think that was really exciting, knowing the sort of opportunities we can have in the future, maybe of measuring the sort of impact that we're having economically. Let's move on. Our next speaker is Gianni, who you met yesterday from the World Bank, and he'll be talking about how his work could also maybe impact our thinking out of the box. Gianni, over to you. And don't forget to press the clicker as well as...
Thank you, Natasha.
Thanks.
Very good idea. Hello, everyone, again. So, in a sense, this is great timing. Thank you, Diane, because if you want, this presentation is about putting the concepts that Diana just presented to work. And this is this presentation gives you an insight on what we are planning at the World Bank. So take our economic system, and we all measure it through GDP. We look at employment, we look at poverty rates, we look at trade flows, and we put economic systems, economic policies in it. Now, let's imagine we were able, and of course this economic system relies on natural resources. It relies on land, on water, on timber, energy. So let's imagine we can actually measure all that stuff, and this is basically the flow of ecosystem services that we receive from nature. and we plug or we just take from nature and put it into economic and make it run. So let's actually imagine that we could build a model that achieves all this. Well, this is exactly what has recently been done by the Global Futures Project, which is led by WWF and with the brain power of University of Minnesota and Purdue University. These two universities basically manage the two sides of this equation. Minnesota University is part of the Natural Capital Project, which is building a series of ecosystem models that look at how biodiversity is able to generate ecosystem services such as pollination, clean water, carbon sequestration, timber, coastal protection, fisheries, for example. So it basically puts in place production functions of ecosystems based on an asset that is biodiversity, essentially. And Purdue University manages the workhorse database that runs a lot of the economic models, the macroeconomic models called general equilibrium models. So together they are integrating these two modeling frameworks to build an integrated modeling framework. And of course, once you do that, you can say, what happens if I start losing biodiversity, and as a result, I start losing some of its services? So it's exactly what Diane was saying. What happens if we lose the steam by depleting and running down one of those key parts of wealth that we rely on? Well, some preliminary results show us actually that you have business as usual. So this is what we project will happen to 2050. GDP, owing to the loss of ecosystem services compared to baseline, GDP could decrease on an annual basis and forever by 1.37% per year. That's the first chart on the top left. Now, if you if you choose different pathways, and here is looking at the IPBES, essentially different scenarios, and then you see the chart on the right, then you start reducing those economic impacts if you choose more sustainable pathway. The most sustainable pathway, which is the one on the bottom left, actually has more benefit. In the charts, basically, hotter colors are decrease in GDP on an annual basis, and cooler color, for example, the blue, is increases in GDP. So there is clearly countries that are clearly winning out from improving the management of ecosystems. Actually, across the world, all countries are winning out with some differences across. These are preliminary results that actually WWF will present very soon in the report of this. Now, let's go back to our model and let's try to improve it. And something we want as economists is understand how can policies influence the state of affairs. So something we could do to improve this is have macro trends and try to see what happens if under different climate scenarios and then different population growth scenarios, what happens to ecosystems and through the economic interactions. But then most importantly, we could say, well, when we do economic changes, for example, we affect economic policies, we have effects that go back into ecosystems, because by implementing certain economic changes, we are perhaps using less land or using less resources. And that in turn provides a flow of benefits, of ecosystem benefits that flow back into the economy. So modeling this feedback between economy and ecosystem is what we are trying to add at this stage with the modeling work. So we're partnering with WWF, Minnesota, and Purdue University to implement these changes. And we're starting to partner also with the Dasgupta Review to model some specific issues. One key issue that is of relevance is what happens if we reach some tipping points in our ecosystems when some services simply collapse, and can we model that? Can we model the economic impacts of that? A second question is what are the poverty implications of hitting certain thresholds or losing certain ecosystems? So this is what macroeconomic modeling allows you to do, and we're trying to make as much extract as much benefit as possible from the modeling framework. So of course, going back, sorry, one second to these, if you see here, I highlighted these economic policies. Something that this modeling framework allows you to do is to see, well, what if I change some economic policies? You know, how do they impact biodiversity, ecosystem, and through that back into the economy? Of course, economic policies have direct implications to the economy. If I reduce perverse subsidies, I'm saving money. So that's a direct impact on finance. But I'm also saving nature, and through nature, I'm having an indirect impact back into the economy. So can we model that? This framework allows you to do exactly that. So the policy scenarios we will be looking at are removal of agricultural subsidies or repurposing of agricultural subsidies, investing in agriculture intensification, introducing disincentives to the inputs of goods and services with embedded biodiversity loss, and adopt or expand the use of payment for ecosystem services, for example, following a water yield, water regulation logic, or carbon storage, or biodiversity conservation. We can have different objectives on the payment for ecosystem service scheme, and we will model this different. So, and we can also look at combinations of these policies and see how this works. The nice thing of these is that then we can start seeing what are the different implications of implementing these solutions and these policy changes, which ones are more cost effective, who wins, who loses from different changes, and start really thinking about, you know, what makes sense to do. We are really at the dawn of integrated modeling this way. We haven't seen much of that until now, but you know, computer power and remote sensing and better information is allowing us to sort of close the gap very quickly. So the idea going forward is to really have a fully integrated economic and ecosystem model. Right now we are really working with our hands to try to patch things together and make it resemble. It's all integrated, but it's actually a lot of work in the background. So in the future, the idea is to develop a fully integrated model that can be used even at the country level. So why do this? One key objective is to provide analytic underpinnings for MBSAPs. MBSAPs set a lot of the stage for these policy changes I talked about. So this type of tool could give an analytical base for that MBSAP. And a key thing is identify cost-effective policy changes, which in turn can inform the dialogue between Ministry of Environment and other ministries. For example, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning. So you see, this allows a common language between different stakeholders in government and interaction. And of course, understand the cross-country impacts of the global biodiversity framework and the different climate scenarios. So yeah, I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Gianni. Great. And yeah, please take a seat on our panel. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome with me Andrew. Many of you met him yesterday when you were sitting at your tables. He was running around trying to support you. Thanks very much. Andrew Deutz from the Paulsen Institute and Cornell Institute. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thank you and good morning. I'm going to present to you some preliminary work that we're working on, a project with, I'm from the Nature Conservancy, but working with the Paulsen Institute and Cornell University to try and answer the question, where's the money going to come from to meet our global biodiversity needs? I like to sort of think of this as the Willie Sutton question. Willie Sutton was a famous American bank robber. When he was finally caught by the FBI and was sitting in prison, and a journalist approached him and said, "Why do you rob banks?" And his answer was, "Because that's where the money is." So what we're trying to figure out is where's the money that's going to pay for the world's biodiversity needs? And in a sense, we're updating the study that many of you might be familiar with from 2015. That was done by WWF, Credit Suisse, and McKinsey. And several of the original authors from that are now working with us. My colleague Eric Swanson from the Paulsen Institute is here, John Tobin from Cornell, who was at Credit Suisse for the original study. And that's the study that came up with the numbers around that there were $50-something billion flowing, and the world needed another 250 or $300 billion to meet the needs. We've revised those numbers substantially upwards, which is a little scary, but what I want to present is some thoughts on how we're going to close the gap and where the money is going to come from. We're hoping to finalize this by April, so these are all preliminary numbers. Don't focus on the individual numbers, just focus on sort of the order of magnitude. And first is sort of our update on, if you want to measure the gap, how much is being delivered. This is just some numbers. You've seen these numbers that we're presenting on where is the current money coming from. These are a little higher than the numbers that Katja presented yesterday. In part, that's because Katja was presenting real data based on 80 countries that they've got data from. We've extrapolated from that for a number of other countries, which raises it. And we've done some more extrapolations around how much money is out there in the systems around payment for ecosystem services, and how much money is out there in the private sector trying to meet those commitments that, over 1,000 companies have made commitments to reduce deforestation in their supply chains. It's notoriously hard to get data on that, but we've made some assumptions and projections. But the point is, though, I think somewhere north of 100 billion is probably out there. There's not hard data behind all of that, so I said those are some projections. And Katja is looking at me and saying, okay. Just to put this in a little bit of perspective, each of those little blue bars on the chart represents one of the major sources of current funding, the biggest being domestic spending. The red bars are perverse subsidies. So the smallest one is fishery subsidies. The next bar up is perverse agricultural subsidies. And the point is, those two subsidy systems alone equal all of the good money that's going into the system. The big red bar is fossil fuel subsidies that are perverse. But the point here is, when we talk about how much money we need for conservation, or how much money is out there for conservation, it is dwarfed by the amount of money that's going out there to undo everything we're trying to do. It's a point that Carlos Manuel made very eloquently yesterday in his statement. So then the next question is, how much money do we think we need? And these are pretty large numbers. Again, this is all preliminary, so some of this is going to change. But to give you a sense of just what we were trying to get our hands on, looking at first, how much money do we need for the protected areas estate? Anthony Waldron, sitting here, is doing a very detailed analysis, so we're just borrowing his research, and you'll hear more on that tomorrow. Then we tried to look at what's going to take to make the production landscapes sustainable. So agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, and there are some good estimates out there. The agriculture number dominates. It's $200 to $300 billion a year is our estimate. That shouldn't be surprising. The IPBES report says that agriculture is the single biggest near-term threat to our conservation outcomes, so it shouldn't be surprising that it's going to be the single most expensive thing to fix. Then we looked at what's it going to take to ensure conservation in the urban environment, looked at combating invasive species and coral reefs and coastal zones. So the urban number turns out to be pretty high as well, and that's just because the cost per hectare of doing anything in an urban environment is extraordinarily high relative to wilderness areas. But the point here is, so we're looking at a gap in the somewhere $500 to $800 billion a year range. Those are higher than the estimates we came up with, or others came up with in 2015. Again, this is still preliminary, but just order of magnitude, several hundred billions of dollars per year is what we need to generate to meet the world's conservation needs. So now the Willie Sutton question, where's the money going to come from? So we've identified sort of 10 different mechanisms that we think collectively can actually generate that order of magnitude resources based on a hopeful set of policy aspirations, market creation opportunities, and changing incentives to scale them up from where they are to where they need to be. So the biggest one is, again, agricultural subsidy reforms or perverse subsidy reforms for fossil fuels and fishery sectors. So I say, if you want to close the gap, there's two different things you can do. You can reduce the need and you can increase the amount of resources. So what we're looking at is both, and the single biggest ticket item to reduce the need is to deal with those perverse subsidies, particularly in the agricultural sector. The second biggest potential source that we've identified are biodiversity offsets. And here what we're looking at quite simply is, since the CBD COP in Sharm el-Sheikh adopted a decision on mainstreaming in the infrastructure and extractive sectors, what are the implications if parties actually lived up to their obligations or their commitments under that decision? If we effectively implemented the mitigation hierarchy, first avoid damage, minimize the impacts, and then offset the residual impacts, if we were to actually rigorously apply that commitment across all of the landscapes that are high biodiversity and facing imminent threat, based on an analysis my TNC science colleagues have done around global development pressures. And the answer, depending on land valuation, is somewhere between $60 and $300 billion a year. That's a huge number, but remember that the world is projecting to spend something like $5 to $6 trillion a year on infrastructure over the next decade or a decade and a half to achieve the SDGs and the world's development aspirations and transition to a low-carbon economy. That's a huge amount of money, but one of the key points here is that's money that's already built into the system. The question is, how do we tweak the rules to ensure that some tiny percentage, we're talking 0.1% of that flow, is being used to support and enhance biodiversity outcomes rather than cause more damage. Domestic budgets, of course, are the single biggest source currently, and we're looking at some potential growth there. Green finance and impact investing is one of the ones that always gets a lot of attention, right? Because those are those cool new innovative models. And the real trick here is the green bond market itself has been growing by leaps and bounds. It's now over $150 billion a year. The challenge is that something like only 4 or 5% of the proceeds from the issuance of the green bonds are going to conservation land use. Most of it is going into sustainable forestry investments. So the question is both, how do you grow the whole larger pie around green investing, but much more importantly, how do we grow the slice that goes to conservation and biodiversity, which currently is quite small. But we're trying to develop a set of recommendations and financing mechanisms on how that can happen. There's actually a conference going on today in New York, hosted by Credit Suisse, on that exact question. But we're fairly bullish that there's big opportunities for growth as a number of mechanisms are coming along. And we can learn from the lessons of how the world scaled up renewable energy and energy efficiency investing 10 or 15 years ago to get to where we are today. The other one I want to highlight here is investing in natural infrastructure and payment for ecosystem services, where we think there's big growth. And again, primarily because we don't necessarily need new money. We've, as the Nature Conservancy, run a series of payment for ecosystem services projects in upper watersheds in a number of countries in Latin America, providing improved or clean drinking water for municipalities. And we're expanding some of that work in Africa and the United States. But it's actually based on the model from New York City, where some smart people figured out in the 1990s that it was cheaper to invest in improving agricultural practices and undertaking conservation measures to improve water quality for New York City than building a water filtration plant and system for New York City. The total capital investment was about a quarter of what it would have been to build the water treatment facility for New York City. Taking that basic logic, we've done an analysis of 2,000 cities around the world and shown that about 600 or 700 of them, so 1/6 of them or so, it's actually cost effective to invest in nature, in changing agricultural practices and in forest restoration to improve water quality. Now, the world already spends something like $500 billion a year on water sector infrastructure. And what we're saying is investing in natural infrastructure actually has a higher ROI for 600 cities around the world. So we don't necessarily need new money to achieve those conservation benefits. What we can do is improve the ROI on the existing infrastructure investment spend in the water sector. It's almost free money for nature in a sense. The critical shift is a policy requirement that would require water utilities and others to examine the opportunities to invest in natural infrastructure. There's a water resources law in the United States now, and the implementing regulations requires the Army Corps of Engineers, who's the largest water infrastructure builder in the United States, to always consider natural infrastructure opportunities in any water sector infrastructure plan. Hopefully that is transformative. It doesn't say always do it, it just says consider the option of natural infrastructure And when it's cost effective, go ahead and invest in that, either on its own or in conjunction with gray infrastructure. If we could universalize that simple requirement, always consider natural infrastructure, that could liberate tens of billions of dollars a year that's otherwise being spent. So again, it's not about new money, it's about tweaking the rules to shift the existing flows to support conservation and natural infrastructure. The last two I want to point out is on carbon markets and land use. There's a big opportunity to scale that. We've been looking at how much money is currently going into the forest sector in voluntary and compliance carbon markets. But where we think the biggest opportunity is probably around the movement that's going on right now around natural climate solutions and looking at the land use sector mitigation potential. There's some recent science out there that shows that about 30% of the near-term mitigation opportunity to keep the world on a 1.5 or 2 degree, below 2 degree pathway can come from the land use sector in a cost-effective way, but below $100 a ton, which means there's a huge opportunity for governments to be investing in forest conservation, forest restoration, and improved agricultural systems to improve soil carbon uptake, because there's a climate logic to it, but there's also a biodiversity logic to it. And so you can get, sort of a double bang for the buck. So, and that can happen both inside carbon markets where you're selling offsets or outside carbon markets simply because it makes sense to invest in the land use sector for carbon mitigation. And then lastly, I'm just going to throw this out there to get some backs up. One of the successes in the Aichi targets, or actually, and then when we went to Hyderabad, is the donor countries agreed to double foreign aid flows over the course of this decade and are on track to do that. We see no reason why those foreign aid flows can't be doubled again, and the annual growth rate is not all that high to make that happen between now and 2020, or between now and 2030. Particularly when you look at the logic of also investing in natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions in the climate world. But the critical point I want to make here is that we need to shift the way we're using that foreign aid, and that since it's relatively small relative to all the other sources of potential funding for conservation, the critical thing is how are we using that money to actually build the capacity in countries to implement the domestic policy reforms, the market creation opportunities, and the incentives for the private sector to unlock all those other flows. So to just summarize a couple of key points here. Number one, even though the gap is huge between what we currently mobilize and what we need, there's a bunch of opportunities out there that we can close the gap effectively. The second key message here is that the resource mobilization agenda and the mainstreaming agendas actually overlap quite a lot. And I'll look at that because the two biggest sources of near-term threat are agriculture and infrastructure development. And yet, if we get the mainstreaming agenda right, it means fixing perverse agricultural subsidies, which can liberate or redirect north of $100 billion. And if we can effectively implement the CBD decision on mainstreaming for infrastructure, i.e. apply the mitigation hierarchy and do biodiversity offsets, we can potentially generate another couple of $100 billion, right? So the mainstreaming agenda generates the funding that can help fix the agriculture and infrastructure sector impacts. The third point is a lot of it doesn't need to be new money. As we say in the agriculture sector, the financial flows are there, and it's not about removing them or stopping investment in the agriculture sector or in any way negatively impacting agricultural productivity. It's about redirecting those flows in ways that are biodiversity friendly, or at least making them biodiversity neutral. And as you say, in the natural infrastructure sector, I gave the water quality example, there are opportunities to invest in nature to improve the return on investment of the existing flows. So even though the number, we're talking $600–800 billion a year, a lot of this money is already moving in the global economy. We just need to direct it in pro-biodiversity ways. Fourth key point is that a lot of what needs to be done is not necessarily inventing new financing mechanisms and innovative instruments. It's about getting the policy reforms in place at the domestic level that's going to require infrastructure investors to apply the mitigation hierarchy. That's going to increase investment in natural climate solutions. That's going to require infrastructure developers to look at natural infrastructure opportunities. It's those tweaks that are going to be necessary, or one of the other mechanisms there was looking at sustainable supply chains for companies. There are trade mechanisms that can do that, as well as companies simply responding to consumer demand. So a lot of this is going to depend on the domestic policy reform agenda, which is what we can help through the CBD process. We can help direct, incentivize, encourage governments to undertake those actions. That's within the realm of what the CBD can do. And then lastly, the foreign aid agenda is not a whole lot of money, even though it's something we spend an awful lot of time debating in this process. But I think the key thing that we need to do with the foreign aid money, particularly, hopefully we can, again, double the doubling, so to speak, by 2030, is focus on in-country capacity building to help countries implement that domestic reform agenda that can unlock the resources from all those other mechanisms, which is where the real money is, which is where Willie Sutton would be looking for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. And there's already quite a lot of questions coming in, which I will be directing to you after our next speaker, who is Marco Albani here from WF, from the World Economic Forum, and he's going to talk about the new nature economy. Marco, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the invitation to be here to present what it's ongoing work. So what I'll be sharing with you is some early results and mostly kind of design concept. The first piece of work will come out next week. We're launching the first report of this series. So I would ask you not, if you want to tweet about it or write a blog post, can you wait until the report comes out next week? Write it, but post it next week so that it creates a momentum around it. So basically, I'm an advisor to the World Economic Forum, which is the international organization for public-private cooperation, and which is engaged in this program called the Nature Action Agenda, which is basically building a platform for public-private cooperation around the objective of halting biodiversity loss by 2030. So that means engaging beyond governments and bringing in private sector, which means both business and civil society, to collaborate in creating an ambitious program of work in which non-state actors can mobilize to support the global effort that we need to turn the tide on biodiversity loss. As part of this work, the World Economic Forum, which with support from the MAVA Foundation, the Moore Foundation, and the Government of Canada, is working on a series of reports called the New Nature Economy Report, which are basically 3 reports. The first one is the one who's coming out next week, and you'll see that's the one I'll focus most on. I'll also tell you a bit about the second report, which is the one we hope to launch in June, and then the third report, we're just starting to lay out the group, the team that's going to work on it, which is about finance. So what you probably would want to hear the most about is the third report, but unfortunately I don't have very much to share about that, but it's actually the third report will look at, in practice, some of the things that Andrew was presenting, how you can actually go out and do them from a private sector point of view. What is the opportunity to actually invest in some of this nature-based solution and biodiversity offsets and other things where private sector can directly participate in restoration or preservation of nature. The first report, which is the one I want to spend more time and is coming out next week, is called Nature Risk Rising, and is making the case for the materiality of the loss of nature and biodiversity as a business and economic risk. And so it's really taking the alarm bell sounded by the IPBES global assessment and translating them in language that goes to business and economic decision maker, and making the case why they also, not just government, they also should care about this and incorporate it in actual enterprise risk management practices, similarly to what has been done for climate risk. And we have seen the big movement, and there was an announcement from BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager, that they will put climate change at the center of their strategy and decision making, and largely that is the consequence of understanding the materiality of the issue to their investors, so as an economic decision. And the second report is called The Future of Nature and Business, and it looks at like what major business transformations are required to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. We know that the way the economy and a lot of the presentation before have touched on this, we need to change the way we think about economic development. We need to change the way in which economic development is done if we are to have a nature-compatible economic development. And so what this report will focus on is, like, in practice, which sectors need to do what and what processes need to be changed. We have a roadmap now, even if it's not 100% clear and 100% bought in by everybody on what an energy transition and potentially even a whole economy transition is to tackle the challenge of climate change. We understand which sectors need to decarbonize and how, and we're trying to start to lay out what I think is going to be more of a 16th century map of what needs to be done as we look at biodiversity. Which sector needs to change, how they need to change, what they need to tackle first. Knowing that not every biodiversity and nature loss issue is an issue in which business has a major role to play. So we really want to sharpen and focus business and economic actors to the portions of the problem where they have the most to contribute. The first report that is coming out next week calls out a nature emergency. That's not something that is new to you at all. I imagine it's largely just translating the work of the IPBES global assessment into business language. But then it does two things. One, it lays out how this nature loss risk translates into actual business and economic risk. So this is not just risk to society or the world or the rest of the living creature we share this planet with, but it's also risk for economic actors. And lays out the three ways in which this happened. And the first is direct risk to the reliance of business and economic activities on ecosystem services and natural capital. And we were able to take advantage of the NCORE database. The work has been done there that has mapped business processes and economic activities to natural assets, and look at that is actually quite substantial. We have identified $44 trillion of global value add in the global economy that are exposed because highly or moderately dependent on natural assets and natural ecosystem services or natural capital to work. The other thing is clearly the risk that comes from the fact that so far the economies has largely used natural assets and ecosystem services if they were free or quasi-free as providers of resources or places in which you would dispose of waste of processes, and has this becomes less and less acceptable because of the crisis we're engulfed in. Clearly, business processes need to change to reflect that action. This is similar to what in the climate risk scenario is called transition risk. This becomes real as regulation or public perception takes into account these issues and call business and economic actors to account to the fact that their ways cannot continue. And the third, and not a small one, is the risk that nature loss creates for society as a whole. And we've seen some pretty dramatic examples of that recently with the fire crisis that has engulfed much of the world over the last year, where it's not necessarily that business is immediately impacted, but generally the societal operations are heavily impacted, and those, the fabric of society, then reflects on business operations and business activities. And a good example is a study of the World Bank. John is here on the impact of deforestation fires in Indonesia during the El Nino event of 2015, looking at extremely outsized economic impact coming through interruption of operations, health effects, and so on, which definitely then becomes business risk for business as well. And then this report then presents a way in which then these issues can be incorporated in enterprise risk management, taking a leaf out of the TCFD book, so the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure, which, as you know, has been doing a lot of work in pushing the formal incorporation or climate risk into business practices. And so the report proposes that a similar conceptual framework can be used by business to translate nature loss and biodiversity risk into enterprise risk management. You'll be able to read the report next week. I just want to call out, this is one of the analyses that basically looks at the exposure of the global economy and shows how business sectors are highly dependent. Some business sectors are extremely dependent on nature today. Often these are not huge contributors to global value add, and often they are the same or actually connected to the problems of nature. But a lot of them are also exposed. If you look on the left-hand side graph, the first bar chart is the direct exposure of the sectors, and the second one is their exposure to their supply chains. And so one thing to which business still need to fully incorporate the extent in which even industries that today feel themselves insulated from nature and biodiversity loss are actually connected to it through their supply chains. And the fact that supply chain transparency and supply chain visibility will increase the visibility of the importance of nature and business, of nature for business. The second chart shows you the contribution of the highly or moderately exposed to nature business activities to the GDP of different countries. And first of all, you can see that is actually reasonably high, and we're looking at 44 trillion, moderately or highly dependent. The highly dependent component is about 3 times the size of the German economy, since we're in Germany. It's higher in middle income, especially middle income countries that have a lot of exposure to agriculture, that are the food baskets of the world, but it's actually pretty high everywhere. So I think my biggest take home from this is that often we see nature risk as kind of a highly agriculture, fisheries, and food dependent economy issue, but it shows that actually, no, that's cutting across. And so all economies and at every stage of economic development are exposed. And in fact, the wealthiest economies, although they don't have the highest percentage of exposure of their economy, in terms of the total exposure of the world economy, they bring a huge component of that. China has the highest component of the world economy with high to moderate exposure, and is followed by the European Union. So if you actually look at who's holding this risk today, who's holding this exposure, this is exposure, it's not risk. Risk is exposure plus hazard plus vulnerability. This is just the exposure. So how much of your economy is exposed to nature doesn't mean that that nature is at risk. But the second largest component of this exposure sits here in the European Union. A brief preview of what Report 2 will do. Report 2 will actually go at the business-first approach on what we need to do. And so this is something for which we're working on right now. The first report was done in collaboration with PwC, I should have mentioned. And this report is done with an economic advisory firm called Alpha Beta out of Singapore. And we're working with them right now, and a number of you have been involved in workshop and socialization of the early work. There'll be a number of these coming in the coming months. So I'll invite you, if you're interested in this work, to reach out to us, and we can definitely want a lot of input. This is basically trying to figure out what are the key areas of biodiversity and nature loss that matter most to business. So where business has the most to contribute, or is the most at fault for driving them. And that turned out to actually not be a trivial exercise. But I think we have now a good sense of where those sit and which industry sectors and business sectors have the most the most to do. And the second one is identifying what business transformation. So really it's trying to get to what are the transformations that are needed? What do we need to do different? There are a number of things that business will continue to have to do in a blocking and tackling kind of good practice management, comply with the law, comply with the regulation, plant manager level kind of activity, right? And those will not go away. But there are some things that are really transformational. If we think about, for example, the points that were made around agriculture subsidies, transforming agriculture subsidy means also transforming how agriculture is done. That's a fundamental business transformation. It's not blocking and tackling. It's not, going from Euro 5 to Euro 6 on your diesel car. It's actually having a different kind of car or not a car at all. And so those are the kind of transformation that we want to point out to. And then identify what are the potential economic and development benefits tied to that. For example, some of the work that the Food and Land Use Coalition has done, and we're taking into consideration, shows a substantial benefit in transforming the food system. That the food system today, if the full accounting is done, is actually a negative contributor to global welfare. And that we need to fundamentally transform it, and that transformation has positive potential. So, because this is still ongoing, what I'm not going to share any results, but I'll ask you to reach out either to myself or to my colleagues at the World Economic Forum if you're interested in taking part, seeing what we're doing, participating. Those are our contact information right now. And with that, I will thank you and take my seat, please.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Marco. Yes, do. Thanks very much to all of our four presenters this morning. Some of our colleagues here have been very active on Wisembly, and there are a couple of questions that I'd like to pick up on. We have until 10:30 for a little round, so let's keep answers as short as possible, and perhaps we can have some different answers coming from the panel as well. I'm just going to take out some that a lot of you have been reacting to, but also others where I think perhaps it could be important for the discussions that we're having as we go on. This is no particular order, but perhaps this one. What would be the cost of mainstreaming the removal of subsidies and policy reforms in developing countries be? Do we currently have enough of that, and who's willing to fund that? Because there's quite a lot of skepticism out there that are these concepts that will work in the developing world as well? So would anyone like to comment on that, please? Gianni?
Maybe I can give a non-answer. So I think the question is, for example, from the standpoint of what I presented, is it's important to understand who benefits and who loses out of removal of subsidies, right? So that's I think the question, and then if you have an answer to that question, then you can say, well, then what needs to be done, and who needs to pay. Or what is the political economy of that? So I think that's the actual action agenda that then needs to engage Ministry of Environment, but also the whole of government, and also negotiation across countries, because very often agricultural subsidies feed global value chains, and it's an important thing to see what the impacts are down the line. So right now I don't have the answer to what's the cost, but yeah, I think before getting to that number, is who wins and who loses is important.
Okay, perhaps just before we have another answer, there's another question here. In Africa and other developing countries, subsidies is what keeps most regimes in power, especially agriculture subsidies. It's called political returns on investment. It's kind of utopian to think reforms will be done in 10 or 20 years. Let's be real. Do you want to, Diana?
I totally agree with that, and it's not just Africa. I think Europe has experienced that somewhat as well. It's getting the transformation for perhaps it's the other end of it. It's the consumer that needs to be fighting for the change, because I don't
you know, the turkey is not going to vote for Christmas kind of thing in this case, taking my farming metaphor way too far. But yeah, I think they're totally right. I think both those comments are really right.
And so how can we deal with this cost question and who's going to pay?
I'm going to start by saying it's not just a developing country problem. I mean, there was a great map that came out recently that mapped the intensity of agricultural subsidies in northern Italy and mapped the intensity of water pollution in northern Italy. It was the same map, right? And I'm sure if you did that analysis in the upper Midwest in the United States, you would find the same problem of agricultural subsidies overlaying with water quality issues. At least speaking to the work that we're doing right now in the United States, the conversation that we're having with farmers is around how do you improve long-term soil health and how do you improve agricultural productivity to make your soils and farming more resilient and more sustainable. And there is a win to be had in the economic transformation of the agricultural practices to be more productive and more resilient in the face of climate change. Changing the inputs and therefore changing the pollution outputs is almost a side benefit to that, but it can still be done through a productivity lens. The biggest question is how do you finance that transition, which is where the subsidy regime comes in and some of the financing mechanisms that we're looking at around rural credit, we're doing this work in Brazil as well, and changing the incentives in rural credit to align with supporting that transition to more sustainable practices. There's a straight up business rationale, there's a straight up financial rationale. That still bumps up against the political rationale, which is very, very different, right? And that's much harder to deal with. So the question has to be, how do you change the political incentives for for basically financing the rural economies, which is a harder question. There's been some good work done by the IMF to look at how do you change subsidies. One of the challenges with most subsidy systems is they are put in place politically to benefit the poor, when in reality it tends to be the middle class and the wealthier who benefit the most. If you look at fuel subsidies in Indonesia, it's mainly the middle class who benefits, not the poor. If you look at agricultural subsidies in the United States, it's mainly the wealthy farmers and industrial farmers who benefit more than the poor. So the real challenge, and I say the IMF has done probably some of the best work about, I don't know if the World Bank has done it too, and how do you shift the subsidy regime so that it's actually the poor who are benefiting and aren't harmed in the challenge, but you still have that political economy challenge of where are the votes and where the political support's coming from. And
Thank you.
It's not easy. This is the really hard work to be done.
That probably also helps answer another question where someone says removing incentives in agriculture and fisheries that harm the environment is vital but require transitions and also specific attention to the poorest people and social aspects. Is anything being done to support these transitions?
And there's also the other issue is the population growth. We can't get away from the fact that we actually need more food over time in different places than we currently have, and finding a way to sustainably intensify what we produce now is going to be incredibly difficult and will require a technology transfer that I don't think we're even really beginning to grapple with at the moment.
In order, as someone says here, to not cut subsidies to save people for the sake to save animals.
Exactly, yes.
Right?
Yeah, so you've got to find that balance between actually feeding people sustainably and healthily and economically without trashing the environment. It's a tough call.
Okay. Perhaps I can bring up another question. This one specifically actually for you, Andrew, but maybe other people have an answer too. What advice can you give as a reasonable target indicator for the key players, governments and private sector? Can a percentage of national or business budgets be used as indicator for tracking commitments, for example?
I suppose, I mean, I saw it yesterday in the commentary, there was a lot of focus on the idea of like, is there a percentage of national budget that should be allocated to biodiversity? Maybe. I would tend to want to break it down sector by sector. As Marco was talking about, there's a handful of key sectors that need to be transformed. Agriculture, infrastructure, energy, urbanization, extractives. So sort of think of like, what are the 2 or 3 key action items in each one of those sectors? And then are governments putting in place the policy reforms to drive that? So like in the infrastructure and extractive sectors, the single most important indicator would be, are you effectively requiring and implementing the mitigation hierarchy? P.S., That's what the CBD says you should do in the mainstreaming decision that we adopted in Sharm el-Sheikh. In the infrastructure sector, or in the agriculture sector, are you aligning your agricultural support system to be pro-biodiversity? In the energy sector, are you planning your transition to renewable energy to be pro-biodiversity? In the urbanization sector, are you doing the land use planning to ensure that your urban expansion and urban development is using natural infrastructure and is not messing up the flow of ecosystem services that your city depends on? It's just like 1 or 2 or 3 key action items in each one of those key sectors, and then the indicators for each of those is probably more important than a single national budget number.
So it's much more about the impact than the input. Marco, would you agree? Is that the sort of understanding that business also has?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I absolutely agree with what Andrew was saying. And I would add also making sure that this idea of understanding your risk exposure to the losses and having, I very much like the idea of the national balance sheet. And these kind of structural transformations, I think, that make you take stock of where the opportunities and the risks are, and then you can look at whether you're actually having an appropriate level of funding to the risks that you're trying to deal with and the opportunity you're trying to capture, and are you incentivizing then the portion of that can be done through public-private cooperation rather than through direct investment at the national level. That seems to me more transformative than having a single figure.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to change the flow now of the discussion because there's a little bit of skepticism out there on, are there any examples on how these reports on finances have actually influenced decision making, in particular with regards to moving harmful subsidies, decarbonisation, adapting business models? But also the question, there's a great deal of overlap amongst all the studies and analyses being undertaken, which will lead to a multitude of messaging at different times and using different analytical tools and lenses, making it very difficult to uptake. What about the coordination? So how effective can we really be, and have we been? And what about the coordination between these and maybe also other studies? Johnny.
So on the how effective are we? I think we don't have a good answer to that, in the sense that we haven't been very effective of using economic analysis to remove subsidies, and we see how much the climate discussion is struggling to get a carbon price up and running, right? So it's super difficult. I cannot think of any clear example. I think the work that Biofin is doing has some examples on adopting economic instruments for biodiversity in their countries. And I don't know if there is any specific example. Then maybe the team from Biofin could reflect on that, if there is any specific example on removal of subsidies. And on the cacophony, yes, I agree. This is a real issue. And to the extent, with the people that are sitting here, at least and more, we have periodic discussions, and I'm sure we will find a way to, accord our violence.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah.
Kadia's back there with her hand up, so we'll give her the microphone in a second. But I want to offer a note of optimism on some of the issues we're dealing with, right? Because I'm sure 15 years ago, people like us were sitting in rooms like this, trying to answer the question, how are we going to pay for the global economic transformation to a low-carbon economy, when the economics of climate change looked very different? But today, there's more money being invested in renewable energy than in fossil fuel energy. There will never be another coal-fired power plant built in the United States. And it's not because of lack of trying by the Trump administration, it's because the economics of the fossil fuel sector have transformed, right? Because it's cheaper to build wind and solar. 15 years ago, people started figuring out the models to develop more investment strategies in renewable energy. They invented a new transactional structure, an energy services company, to figure out the financing to support investments in energy efficiency. My point is, we've kind of figured out how to do the economic transformation to make investing in a low carbon economy possible. It hasn't taken off to the extent it needs to, and we need to desperately press the accelerator on that. But the world has sort of figured out what that economic transformation and investment transformation might look like for climate. So we're still in the early days on biodiversity, but I'm still somewhat optimistic that we can figure this out. So if you're hearing a cacophony of voices, there's a similarity in the particular sectors we need to focus on and what some of that transformation might look like. And we've got some hints of what some of those business models and business practices and financial structures might look like and what some of the necessary policies are. So I'm kind of optimistic that we figured out what we need to do on climate. We're not there yet, but we're in the process of figuring out what we need to do on biodiversity. And I work for an NGO. I have to be optimistic that we're going to fix this because I desperately don't want to stand in front of my kids 20 years from now and them looking at me and saying, "What did you do with your whole career?" So I have to be optimistic that we're going to figure this one out too.
Thanks for that. Katya, do you want to comment?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. I just wanted to provide some further information on subsidy reform, and in terms of good practice and examples of actual subsidy reform, we did a review in 2017 in a publication we released, which is called The Political Economy of Effective Biodiversity Policy Reform. And we looked at some of the most recent examples of policy reform, including covering subsidies for fisheries, pollutants, pesticides, the reform also in terms of implementing taxes, etc., and came up with recommendations for countries that are interested in being able to implement more effective policy reforms, given that this is actually quite a challenging issue. So we have that work and a summary of a number of other reforms over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years before that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me just pick up on another couple of things that are coming in. There's some interesting discussions again about what should we be talking about when we're talking about resource mobilization. So this just says removal of threats is a discussion in another forum. We're setting ourselves for failure in resource mobilization. This meeting needs to inform the real issues in resource mobilization. What do you say to that? Do you agree? Not everyone agrees with that. This is very controversially discussed here. We have 3 people saying like this, 2 going like this, and 1 going. Do you agree? Anyone want to take it? Johnny or Marco?
I'm just very quickly. For me, resource mobilization is, if you take the world economy, there is this much resources, and you're using in a certain way. You're spending money doing certain things. So resource mobilization is about doing less of something and more of something else. And that's really the trick. So that's my view on resource mobilization, which doesn't mean to spend more. It means changing the way you're using those scarce resources. So
Okay, thank you, Marco. Wanted to.
Yeah, I just want to address something before on the cacophony and the difference of voices. I would not be worried about that if I were in you. I would be worried about kind of pulling out the key messages that you want to use, but the reality that we're dealing with life on Earth, right? So that's the biggest problem. Together with climate change, the biggest problem we have. There's 7 billion people on the planet. We cannot expect that there's going to be a single message around that, right? It's natural. That's a big issue. And different people will need different voices and will need different institutions to say things in a different way from a different angle. So I wouldn't be worried about that, and I think it's actually a strength of the importance of the issue that we actually have different institutions working on this at the same time. Now we're trying to, I think the people at this table, we're all kind of staying in touch, and we're trying to create platform to coordinate, but to some extent it's necessary that there are multiple voices talking about this issue. Only if it's a niche, small issue that you can have, if you're the International Association for the sizing of the length of sardines, then obviously you're going to have a single voice. But if you're talking about life on Earth, you cannot have a single voice. I also want to touch on the fact that the question, I've lost the question by answering this, so I'll pass on.
Diana's.
I'll help you. I totally agree with Marco, and that what I spared you was the economics that we have going on underneath the Dasgupta review, because I'm sure nobody here wants to look at a bunch of equations at 9:15 in the morning. Maybe you do, and I apologise for that. So we're trying to appeal to a different group of people. So I think this is right. If there's a lot of people saying it, hopefully someone's eventually going to hear it. But in terms of the resource mobilization question, one of the things that I think we have to consider is the actual, how long has that phrase, resource mobilization, been applied to CBD policy? And that's probably 20 odd years. And I think nature conservation has changed over the last few decades from being more about protected areas, where we wanted resource mobilization to pay for protected areas, to now understanding that our whole planet is in crisis and we need to do something bigger and wider. And I think that's why resource mobilization has gone from something about paying for particular areas and how we use it to something which is actually how do we look after our planet in a wider context. Now, I might be wrong. I hope that's led to a bit more, ideas, but...
Okay. Let me just, yes, definitely open up two voices directly from the floor, both on that table. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, this is Andrei Kushlin. I want to revert back. One of the panelists mentioned earlier that the bottom line of all these questions is the consumer behavior. The taxpayer and the economic actors depend on the bottom line consumer behavior. And let me throw in a little bit of an anecdote, which is actually true. Once at a National Geographic presentation of some documentary on conservation, there was a question asked. So why is it that the Lion King franchise globally grosses, now I think it's $8 billion, but we are still struggling to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for lion conservation? So this was such a striking question that it stuck in my head, and I, ran around in the subsequent months and years asking that question to various people, including like Prince William, okay? And I ended up again, after a while, at another National Geographic event in DC, and there was a crowd, and there was James Cameron, the famous entertainer guru and film industry guru. So I managed to come and address this question to him. And his answer was most striking. People will throw inordinate amount of money for entertaining themselves. But the moment you trigger the guilt factor, the wallets shut up. So the answer to that is that it's fine for businesses to keep their eyes focused on risk management, and including the natural risk and whatnot. It's fine to keep revising the regulatory structure, the incentive structure, the subsidies and whatnot, but at the bottom of all of that is, again, it's consumer behavior. So only as and when every act of consumption could be linked to some regenerative act wherever. So this is what the new emerging regenerative economy is about, and there is now a whole thread of developments. Again, I come back to the fintech and to the transaction businesses, transaction industry. They start looking at how, even at the optimizing the transactions, they could squeeze that decimal point of a percentage point of consumer spending that could be redirected to regenerating what we use. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. And you're echoing a lot of what I'm seeing here also about the consumer behavior. And the colleague at the same table, please, from the Netherlands.
A very short question about systemic financial risk. That was one of the things that really hit the financial world. But Mark Carney said there will be systemic financial risk because of biodiversity loss. Will that be part of your projects as well? So not only for the individual company, but also for financial systems. Thank you.
Anyone want to answer the question? Or it's more a statement of Marco, please.
So no, we did not assess the systemic nature of the financial risk brought by the nature crisis. But one of the things, and partly because we wanted to come out, the reason why somebody had commented here, said that, World Economic Forum had this report 10 years ago, are you just doing the same? No, there's new material, but also we're in a new moment. Have a look at the global risk report of the World Economic Forum when it comes out. That's the risk, the mapping of the global risks. So that goes from weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, everything, right? It's not an environmentally oriented one. And see what are the top global risks that are going to come out in 2020. I cannot spoiler it. It's coming out, I think, if not this week, next week, but very, very soon. Or maybe it came out yesterday. I don't know the exact date. But go and have a look. We're in a different moment. So we came out with this report on risk. We wanted very much to anchor it to that, because I think we're going to get a different audience. We did not do the analysis of the systemic nature. The only thing I would say about that is that it's impossible to tear apart the nature risk from the climate risk if you're actually looking at the physical impacts. A lot of climate risk is really climate and nature risk. A lot of nature risk is nature and climate risk. It's the concurrent degradation of natural assets that buffer us from the impact of climate, and the impact of climate on those natural assets then creates the big catastrophic effects. And the second thing is that a lot of these are, I don't like to call them black swans because we know they're coming, so they're not black swans. We know they're there. But they are trigger points that are hard to predict when they will happen. So it's hard to treat them with traditional risk management approach of basically saying that it's the fat tail problem. We know that there is this risk. We know that the risk is that something really bad happens. And we hope that the probability is so small that the really bad goes away, but we don't really know that it is so small, so we need to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much. I know a lot of you would still like to speak, and I'm very sympathetic about that, and we have the whole day actually to dwell deeper on this. I'd like to sum up what I'm also reading in here, just to give you all an idea of what we're talking about, and then introduce what we're going to be doing for the rest of the day, where you have these fora to get into the discussions about, okay, what does that mean for us? What sort of options could we be creating and thinking about coming out of also this sort of thinking? There's a lot of sympathy that I'm seeing for renaming the concept to biodiversity finance, which people are saying would be more inclusive, and when we're talking about resource mobilization, wouldn't just limit us to thinking about generation, and perhaps also give it this more transformative approach. There's quite a lot of skepticism in this room, and I think we need to be very, very aware of that in the discussions we have later, that we are being real. Someone has written "get real" twice here. Are we just having a North discussion, or are we really talking about the whole of the world concepts that are relevant for all of us? There's also the skepticism about what the convention can actually achieve. Well, maybe we need to be also rethinking the convention in the backs of our minds when we're talking about going to 2030, really sort of stretching and elbowing our way out. And other than that, lots and lots of how do we change consumer behavior? How do we really get the political will in to actually want to implement this sort of transformative policy that we're talking about here? So, great big thanks to our 4 speakers this morning. Will you be able to give a little bit of be a resource person if people need you? Are you around for the rest of the day? Yeah, okay, so perhaps you can sort of go in and out of rooms and be there and be part of the discussion. If you have any individual questions of each of the speakers, please talk to them. And let's give them a big hand. Thank you. Great, so moving on, let's go to agenda item 6, which is identifying scalable resource mobilization solutions, or perhaps we should call it the sustainable finance, or what do we call the biodiversity finance solutions. We have 5 thematic breakout groups. So they're rotating, which means you are rotating. So you will be in 5 different rooms throughout the day. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. They are led by facilitators, because the groups are going to be a little larger than yesterday. So you'll have also more diversity within your group. It's on the back of your name tag, you'll see which group you're in. So you will be able to contribute to all of the topics. They will all be dealing with the same 2 guiding questions, which are, based on what was discussed yesterday and presented in the morning, what could be the main options for scalable resource mobilization solutions? And so that's like the what do we want to do? And the second part of that is, how do we get there? What are the necessary leverage actions, conditions, that we need to achieve those. And that's where we need to get real, okay? So first of all, we're thinking almost visionary. We're saying 2030, what do we want to have achieved? And then we're looking back and saying, yes, but there are lots of barriers that we need to overcome, whether it's the convention, whether it's the political will, whatever those barriers are that we need to change. And so it's like, do this and make it possible by ... We have an hour for each of the sessions, so you can really get into some detail. Our facilitators will be making sure that we really do have 100% participation and get real. And we're not in the drafting framework, right? We're not drafting anything here. We're thinking about the options. So next slide. You can see the topics. So depending on what you've got on, can I just see what you've got on the back of your, so item 6, group 3, right. So group 3, Gregor, will be starting at station 3, okay? And let's just go through the different stations. Station 1 is mainstreaming biodiversity into national economic budgets and development plans. And I want to make this very clear that this is not just how to write it into the plan. We don't need to spend 5 hours talking about that. This is about the real strategy and tactics of actually mainstreaming biodiversity into the finance strategy of national budgets. Station 2, and sorry, Katja will be the facilitator of that. And she's going to be with all of the groups, always on that topic throughout the day. Station 2 is the readiness and capacity of parties to access and utilize financial resources with Jeremy. Again, Jeremy will be with all of those groups. Then we have 3 on actually the mobilizing of resources from all sources and institutions at all levels. So Christina Bowers, who's there, she's going to be facilitating Station 3, mobilizing resources from international sources. Station 4 is with Tracy, who you met yesterday. Where's Tracy? She's definitely there, I've seen her. And she is going to be facilitating mobilizing resources from domestic sources. And Station 5 is mobilizing resources from private sources with Gianni, and I'm sure there are a lot of aspects of the discussion from this morning that we can continue in that station. So do we have an overview in the slide of where the different... Yeah, okay. So Station 1 is always going to be in the Grenanda Room 1, which is where we had the reception yesterday. So you will move there. And you have to work it out. So Gregor, I'm going to take you. The first session, you're going to be in Station 3. The second session, you're going to be in Station 4. Third one in 5. Fourth one in 1. Fifth one in 2. All right? So you count onwards. When you get to 5, you start from 1 again. Does that make sense? Phew. Station 2 is always going to be in Grenady 2, which is, again, where we had the reception, and Grenady 3 is also where we had the reception, where Station 3 will always be. Alexander 1 and 2 is this, and that's where Stations 4, domestic, and Stations 5, private, will always be. So you rotate. And the timing is pretty tight. You do get some breaks. But the timing will be starting after the break at 11:15, and then going on. Oops. Alexander 1 and Alexander 2. Alexander 1 is next door, correct? Yeah, next door. And this is Alexander 2, right? And they always take place there. So I'm not going to give you all the times now, it's too much information. In your program, you can see when the different modules start, and your facilitators will be brilliant on timekeeping because they know that if they're not, all the other groups systemically suffer. So that's big thanks to the facilitators for timekeeping. So let's take a break now. 1:15, on the dot, let's start in the station that you are starting in. and enjoy the discussions, think outside of the box, get real, but also give yourself the freedom to get bigger and out of your comfort zones as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all here at 6 o'clock, where we have our first update on what sort of options we're seeing. All right? Just 2 pieces of information that I'm being asked. The first is, it says group on your name badge. Group is station, all right? So if you have group 4, you start station 4. The second thing is, the documentation of yesterday is to be found in the documents session of Ysembly. You can see all of the priorities that you chose yesterday in Ysembly in the documents section.